Good morning. It is such an honor to welcome and introduce Dr. Mary Carskadon. Dr. Carskadon is a professor of psychiatry and human behavior at Brown University and is the director of the Sleep Research Laboratory at the E.P. Bradley Hospital in Providence, Rhode Island. Her honors are numerous and include the National Sleep Foundation's Lifetime Achievement Award, as well as election as a fellow in both the American Association for the Advancement of Science and the Association for Psychological Science. Dr. Carskadon's research established the foundational understanding that sleep cycles vary across the lifespan, and that there are consequences when one's sleep schedule does or does not align with those cycles. You may have noticed that this work was acknowledged numerous times yesterday in both our talks and in discussion. In addition to providing the basis for continued research, her findings and advocacy have influenced policies and practices in education, the workplace, and even disaster management. For example, Carskadon was an advocate for shifting school start times to better align with teens' natural sleep cycles, which was then proven to benefit students' physical and mental health, academic performance, and behavior. And as an educator, thank you for that. To provide another example that might resonate with some of our Gustavus students, she is exploring questions such as, how do travel schedules impact the overall well-being and performance of student athletes? Most recently, Dr. Carskadon has also put out calls for continued research and recognition of the ways in which cultural and socioeconomic factors impact who is privileged by institutional practices, such as work schedules and school start times. In today's talk, Clock, Hourglass, and Teen Sleep, Dr. Carskadon will help us understand the biological and developmental factors that explain why teens have a very good reason to ask for later bedtimes and to sleep in the morning. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Mary Carskadon.
Thank you so much. Well, good morning. I hope everyone slept well. I did. Even despite being just overwhelmed by Minnesota nice. Everywhere I go. And I want to thank you all for inviting me to come here, and for all the other speakers you invited who have been stunning. A special shout out to my spirit guides, Eleanor, where did you go? Eleanor, and Mohammed, and Victoria, who guided me all around campus and really carried my bags, just were so gracious, and Minnesota nice. I want to give a special shout out to Coach Tommy, not Coach Tim, to Coach Tommy and the gents on the men's tennis team who were so much fun to work with yesterday. But especially Coach Tommy. Well, let me also mention the students who were at breakfast this morning, from whom I asked fashion advice, and they said, show us your superpowers. And so does this make me an official Gusty? Okay, well, you can tell I'm excited to be here and to share some of what I've learned over the many years of doing research. And I hope I can explain it in a way to help you all understand as well. So, clock, hourglass, and teen sleep. So the central observation that underlies what I'm going to talk about today is this. Adolescents who were once such champion sleepers, so eager to start the day, waking with a smile on their lips, joy in their heart, turn into, we won't call them monsters, but they begin to struggle against going to sleep in the evening and struggle to wake up in the morning. So that's the observation. It's not new. In fact, this is a quote from a paper published in 1913. Terman and Hawking, they summed this up as, it may be that adolescents tend to change the individual from the vesperal to the matinal time of sleeping. And so that's, again, those words ring true in a chapel. I don't know, do you have Vespers here? Used to. So, in other words, they like to sleep in the morning, and they used to like to sleep in the evening. Parents in the audience, any parents of adolescents, teens? Okay, so you've probably experienced this transition in your own kids. Here's a quote from a parent. My 13-year-old son's sleep phase was a phase-shifted nightmare. That too seemed to happen overnight. Get it? No pun intended. I spent his early childhood wishing I could sleep past 5:30 on a Saturday morning. And now I spend most of Saturday trying to get him out of bed by dinner. So it's really the common phenomenon. This, even novelists. This is from a book by Mary Gordon, and this is her adolescent character saying, my adolescent sleeps were long, dark, and sullen. Never once in all those years did I wake of my own accord. It's a thing, people. It is a thing. And it's a challenge. It's a challenge not just for the teens, but for their families as well, and also for the school system. There's the challenge. That doesn't work. So I want to talk to you this morning about things you've heard about so far to really get the biological foundation. Circadian timing, that's our clock. Sleep-wake homeostasis, that's our hourglass. And the consequences in adolescence. So, yeah. Yes. Sleepy, dopey, you know the guys. So just to review, and I'm glad I have a little redundant material here from what you heard yesterday, but these are independent processes. So we call sleep pressure, process S, which is in the top graph here. And so when we're awake, the pressure rises. But it's relieved when we sleep, okay? So that's one independent process. The other is process C, or the circadian timing system, which oscillates daily with a circadian daily rhythm. So these two things independently work to provide the structure for sleep, but they also collaborate. And when we are playing the game right, they collaborate to make our days and our nights very, very good. But we often don't collaborate well. So you see here, so the homeostatic is really a drive to sleep that then we dissipate when we actually do sleep. The circadian timing system provides this alerting signal to offset this pressure to sleep, which allows us to stay awake all day long. Otherwise, by the end of, by supper time, we'd be eating with our face in the plate. So they interact. They're interdependent. So let's look first at the circadian timing system. So I'm going to give you chapter and verse on sort of the terminology so that you can follow the science when we go further. So it's a complex system, but we can describe it with some simple terms. First is phase. So that's any point on the cycle, any point on this oscillation. So shown there, or pointed to, is acrophase, but the trough is another phase. Pick one, pick your favorite, and that would be a phase that we could measure. Then there's period. Period is how long it takes for the cycle to repeat. So that's, we talk about the word circadian. It's meaningful. It's circadian. It's about a day. So we're entrained today, so it's 24 hours when we're living in the real world, but internally the clock isn't quite 24 hours. It's circadian. This just shows you how that plays out. This is, you learned about double plotting yesterday. This is wheel running in a mouse for almost 3 months, and the clock keeps ticking the same time, day after day after day after day. The mouse climbs up on his wheel, is alert and awake about a half hour earlier for us every day, but it's a circadian rhythm. So the period for that mouse is about 23 and a half hours. Amplitude, that's the strength of the rhythm, and that also can be measured and can change, and so we'll look at a little bit of data on that. So another complex part of this, which was alluded to yesterday, is that the clock responds to light input, which I'm getting from that spotlight right there. Oh, and that one over there. But it's occurring, that light is occurring for me here in the middle of my daytime. And so it's not affecting my phase. And although the light this morning on the tennis courts was occurring here, or I guess here, at the beginning of my daytime, and so that may have pushed my clock a little bit earlier. So you can manipulate your clock by when and how much light you get. This is just another view of that phase response curve. You get light in the daytime, great, you're supposed to, because we're diurnal animals. We are day active. You get light during the night, early night, it's going to push you later, which makes sense. You get light in the end of the night, it pulls you earlier so that you can synchronize to your light signals. Light phase response. So we measure phase. We can do it with a subjective measure, phase preference. How do you feel at certain times of day? When is your favorite time to be awake or to do your sport or to do your studying? Phase preference. But another way to measure it is what's called chronotype, and I'll show you how that changes during adolescence in a few minutes. But that's more, when are you sleeping? When are you being awake? Then we can measure intrinsic phase. So we have phase preference, but we also have an objective measure, so of a biological signal. We can measure period, the internal day length, not by putting humans in a cage with a running wheel. Humans aren't good at that. The other thing about the mice is it was constant darkness. So mice are nocturnal. They're fine if it's dark all the time. Humans, not so much. So we have a different way of doing this in humans that's also fun. Then we can measure the phase response to light. So we can give a light signal at a certain time and see the resultant activity. And we can measure the amplitude of a biological signal. So let's go through these things and see how they change during adolescence. First, remember this, our central observation, the teen's clock phase gets later. There it is, getting later. So it's not just humans. The biologists who've studied other species during their juvenile phase have seen the same thing. So humans, monkeys, Octodon degus, my favorite rodent, The lab rats, lab mice, oh, the fat sand rat, I thought you'd be curious to see what he looks like. Little chubby guy in the sand. And the most recent was the marmoset. So it's not just humans. And I think that's important to know. I'm not calling humans, you know, mammal. I mean, they are mammals, but not these guys, not rats and mice. So we mentioned chronotype. So this is a way to measure chronotype that was developed by Professor Till Rundberg from Germany. And it's a behavioral measure, but it's changing developmentally. So let me explain this to you. So this chronotype is the middle of sleep on nights when you don't have a reason necessarily to go to bed and nothing is getting you up in the morning. So we call them free nights. So 3 a.m., 4 a.m., 5 a.m. Keep in mind that the middle of darkness is called midnight. We're not sleeping with the middle of our sleep being midnight. That's because of all these lights and all of the things we've done to change our sleep and the timing of our sleep in industrialized societies. So this is just showing, you can see the adolescent decade here, and you can see this mid-sleep phase gets later and later and later and later and later. And then there's this inflection, which Rundberg calls the biological marker of the end of adolescence. So that place right there. At any rate, we can see, everyone can see very clearly there's this change, there's this delay in the timing of sleep. So again, it reinforced this behavioral pattern that we start with. So let's look at our intrinsic phase marker. We use melatonin as our intrinsic phase marker in my lab. We get saliva samples every half hour and then measure the what we call the onset phase of melatonin. So that when the rising phase begins is when we're measuring. So that's a phase marker for us. And here, this is a sample of a boy who was 8 years old, so pre-adolescent, and his phase was about 8:36 p.m., his onset phase of melatonin. Here are data from, I'll pause for a minute and explain what Tanner stage is. So Tanner stage is a way of grading pubertal status. Tanner stage 1 is pre-pubertal. So it's kids who haven't started showing any of the secondary sex characteristics that get more and more impressive as those numbers go up. So Tanner stage 5 is the mature adolescent. What we see when we measure this melatonin phase at different puberty stages is it's getting later and later. So here, for example, is that 8-year-old we were just talking about, but now our mature adolescent, 16, 17-year-old, it's hour and a half, 2 hours later. So this biological signal is changing in the same way we're seeing behavior change. So the other thing we know is teens stay up later, so that's also targeting this system as well. When they stay up later, they're delaying their rhythms if they're getting light. Oh yeah, sitting in front of a computer screen or another type of screen, TV screen. So it pushes phase later. And then they sleep in, they don't get that morning pull you back. This is just data from a mouse model. So we talked about model systems, model animals the other day. And here you can see the juvenile mouse given light during the dark phase shows a much greater delay in their rhythms than the adult mouse. So this is another sign that biology is changing. So we also can measure intrinsic period, as I mentioned, not in a cage with a running wheel, but we use a method called forced desynchrony, where we've had kids come into the lab for 3 weeks under dim light conditions, because melatonin is our phase marker, and the production of melatonin is inhibited by light. So they're in our lab, and they have great fun. Well, why? Because we have undergraduate research apprentices working with them one-on-one. So just a brief pause for the students who may be looking for an internship for the summer. sleepforscience.org, and you can find our research apprenticeship. Just saying, and it's a paid apprenticeship. Anyway, always looking for Minnesota nice. So here you see, so when we do that, at 20 hours day length, your body can't adjust to that, so you run free, just like the mouse did. Only in adolescence, they're running free at a much slower period or longer period than grown-ups do. So again, there's another biological signal that something is changing during adolescence. And I mentioned amplitude. So here's Stephanie Crowley, a graduate student of ours, took our data from these kids at the different Tanner stages. And you can see Tanner 1, they had high amplitude. Tanner 5, it was a much lower amplitude. Well, so what does all of this really imply? So, clock and teens. So phase delays, we've confirmed that. We knew that, but now we've confirmed it biologically. So the melatonin onset phase gets later. And also, the light-dependent change also can happen. The period is longer. The delay response we saw in the mouse is greater. The amplitude is lower. The result is late nights are favored by the clock. But so too are late mornings. So it's the whole system that's delaying. All right, so now you know everything you need to know about the circadian timing. What about sleep-wake pressure, the homeostatic system? The hourglass. So you saw nice hypnograms yesterday. So this is what it looks like. And remember, the deepest sleep is occurring most often in the early morning. So that's a qualitative assessment of sleep, looking at the stages across the night. But we can also look at the EEG pattern and do a quantitative assessment with spectral analysis, which we see here, the same data across the night. So low frequencies, that would be the slow, deep sleep, are here at the bottom, higher frequencies at the top. And then we can further take just the spectral data from the very low frequencies and look at how that plays out across the night in spectral power in the low frequencies, or slow wave activity. So it's really clear that the Rocky Mountains of slow wave activity at the beginning of the night dissipate across the night. And this is what we've learned is a perfect, not quite perfect, but an excellent biological marker of this sleep homeostatic system. It increases the amount of slow waves. So again, deep slow wave sleep, the qualitative way, EEG slow wave activity, and then I'll throw in a third, the speed of falling asleep. So what happens during adolescent development? Well, first I'll just show you the look of sleep changes. So here we have this girl who was age 10, Tanner stage 1, and she was then, oh no, these are two different kids, sorry. But the message is the same. So you can see stage 2 sleep with its characteristic waveforms, the deep sleep with the high voltage, very slow EEG activity, and REM sleep, lower activity and sort of more random. So now the mature adolescent shows the same patterns, but what's different? The amplitude of the signal. Well, that's not part of what regulates sleep. That's part of showing what's happening in their brains. So they have this sort of programmed synaptic pruning. So there's less infrastructure underlying brain waves as kids mature. So here's another way of looking at that. Here we have the hypnogram in the gray and the slow wave activity in the black. This is the same child 2 years apart and maturational distances apart as well. So you can see that it doesn't take math to know that this is not the same as this. There's about a 40% decline. And then when we look at slow wave power, again, you can see the huge maturational change that's occurring there. But again, that's not regulating anything, that's just the phenomenology. So my Swiss colleagues, can I back up? Oscar Yaney and Peter Ackerman did some modeling based on some of our data. And you can think of this, the decay, this emptying out of our hourglass, or the recovery from being awake all day. That stays the same in early Tanner stages and mature Tanner stages. But the filling up of our hourglass actually gets slower in the more mature adolescents. So about 9 hours in the pre-pubertal adolescents, about 12 hours in the post-pubertal adolescents. Well, the other thing to show you is this speed of falling asleep, sleep propensity. So here are kids at Tanner 1, Tanner 5 that we kept up all night, and we measured every 2 hours how long it takes them to fall asleep. You can see they're riding along pretty well until they've been awake for 14 and a half, 16 and a half hours, at which time they separate. And the pre and early pubertal kids can't stay awake as long, they fall asleep faster. Post-pubertal kids can maintain their wakefulness longer. You get out to 18, 20, you get out beyond that, and we call that the twilight zone. And I'm sure some of the professors here think, oh, my student, that one looks like he's in the twilight zone. It's just the drool and the... Yeah, it can happen. So again, this adolescent change. So we can summarize this, emptying the hourglass, there's no change across adolescence. So to me, that says you need the same amount of sleep. Filling the hourglass is slower. So it's easier. So not only is the rhythm pushing later, but it's easier to sustain wakefulness longer in the older teens. So late nights are easier to achieve, but the same amount of sleep is required. Well, so who cares? Well, here's the fly in the ointment, if you will, school start times. And Minnesotans probably know this better than any place else, because when we first, I gave a talk in Minneapolis a while ago. It's been a minute. And Dr. Mark Mahauld was at the talk, and he said, this is ridiculous, this is terrible. And he went to the state medical association, and they passed a resolution, and they went to the state, and then we got an educator involved. I'm not an educator. So Kyla Wallstrom from the Center for Education Something Research at the University of Minnesota got on board and started doing the work in the school districts locally. And you've all heard about Superintendent Dragseth from, oh, remember the name of the town? Edina, which was the first school in the nation to realize this and to make a change. And then the Minneapolis School District made a change. And all the while, Dr. Wallstrom is collecting data and seeing that, yes, it makes a difference. So you guys led the way. It's a public health issue now. It's now gone global. I mean, I recently had the opportunity to speak in Abu Dhabi, in Dubai, Saudi Arabia, in, well, Australia, but I go there anyway, because Australia is cool. But it's so interesting to me. Singapore, I mean, people are concerned about this. And it disadvantages, at least in the States, it's unfair more so for specific groups of people than for others. So there's good evidence for disadvantaging kids with lower socioeconomic status, kids with learning or behavioral challenges, kids who are from different racial, ethnic, religious minorities are also at a greater disadvantage depending on how things are structured. And I think, we're here, you all have a lot of areas that are rural with centralized schools in high schools. So it disadvantages those kids whose bus ride is longer. And it's so interesting to me, it's like, I wish there was one solution that fits all, but there isn't. Kids in Seattle who might ride city buses, they made the change. They have school buses as well. But, you think about, I don't know, Minot, North Dakota is going to be different. So it's a challenge, but it's also a concern for educators and parents and students. So this was a model we put together, our perfect storm. So in pre-adolescent, sleep is great. You get nice, long, healthy sleep. You go to bed at a good time. You wake up smiling and happy. Then you start getting through adolescence and you get the circadian phase delay, the slow rise of sleep pressure, pushing the sleep, the black bars, later. And this is fine because they're still getting enough sleep if the black bar can go this far. Then you have, I want to go to bed later, bedtime autonomy, academic pressure, I have so much homework, and all these other social engagements, again, pushing later. But whoops, then we have society coming in and saying, get up and go to school, or the high school ice time is the earliest in the mornings, get up so you can get your ice time. And it really then just squeezes sleep out of the picture. And then on the weekends, they have this sleep delay, which results in what we call social jet lag. So on school days, they're living in Rhode Island, but their brains are in LA. And so on the weekend, they can let their brain clocks express itself. Social jet lag. So there are consequences. Excessive sleepiness, impaired learning, impaired behavior regulation. Risk-taking is a big thing, especially for adolescents, because that's part of their job. But this sort of accentuates the risk-taking of adolescents. Substance use, I include caffeine. My mantra is no child needs caffeine. Now, adolescents not getting enough sleep probably do need caffeine. But to give caffeine to the prepubertal kids, not good. Crashes, there's nice data, tragic data on automobile crashes with teen drivers who go to school early. Depression, suicidality. I mean, these things are getting worse and worse in adolescence in this part of the 21st century. And then we heard about the metabolic changes of insufficient sleep. So there are hazards. So, this is one of my favorite books, and it's not just because of the title, but it does. So one character, there are only two really main characters. Ryland Grace says, humans are stupid when we need sleep. He's speaking to an alien, Rocky, who says, human no function well after no sleep. And I love this book because this guy knows about sleep and sleep need. So there are challenges, there are problems. For teens, sleep is not a waste of time, regardless of how they perceive it. Oh, and by the way, it's not a waste of time for we grown-ups, for us grown-ups, sorry, English teachers. So I left are any of the men's tennis team here, or are they all online? Because they decoded my last slide yesterday. Can anybody here decode this? Right, less sleep doesn't give you more time because you're much less effective the less sleep you have. You have to read that paragraph 5 or 6 times. You have the problem of not saving your work and your essay gets trashed. Less sleep does not equal more time. So I want to acknowledge and thank undergraduates who worked with me, sleepforscience.org, graduate students, postgraduate students, colleagues and mentors, funding agencies. Where's Mariska? Thank you very much. And the participants and their families. And I want to thank you for your attention and again for your Minnesota Nice and inviting me here. And Coach Tommy. Thanks.